Good. Then I have a friend, Jürgen LeSS. He lives in Belgium, and we wrote a book. So maybe I can explain actually why we even actually start to talk about this topic. And it's a problem that we observed for a very long time, but it was never really labeled as a cognitive load. We just, there was no need to do that. And so it's a typical dynamic that we observe in companies, which is that the people are overwhelmed. So I like to use a more normal English word. And so just feeling overwhelmed. And then suddenly, almost out of nothing, there is suddenly the term cognitive load, and specifically team cognitive load. And so, anybody familiar with the term? Oh, wow, quite a few people. Yes, good. So, it sounded like something new, and lots of people felt very recognized. Hey, we have indeed, exactly, that's the problem. Finally, somebody pointing out the problem, and recognize that this is actually a problem. And then the whole book is written on that, and many people start to talk about, etc. And but then for me, there wasn't really anything new about it. And but then the conversation about it became extremely simplistic. And so the purpose of this talk is to explain you actually what's actually going on when we talk about this problem, actual problem, of teams feeling overwhelmed, or people just feeling overwhelmed. So the first, before we dive in, and first of all, I'm not a psychologist or anything like that, so I also learned myself, and I quite a lot about this in the past few years, and to figure out more from a psychology first point of view, what are we actually talking about? So psychologically, outside of drug development, what it is the amount of working memory resources used. Okay, so we have a thing. If I ask you, for example, to remember a bunch of numbers, okay, so and if I state 8 random numbers, the chance that you're going to remember those 8 random numbers after that is not very high. Actually, according to research, very few people will actually succeed in that, which is remarkable. You can't even remember 8 body numbers. Okay? So, in fact, actually, even if I say things like 7, 29, 34, 65, you already start to forget the first numbers. You didn't forget, but okay. So it's pretty remarkable. So this is to give you a bit of idea of a most fundamental level, what are we talking about. So it's kind of like, in computer terms, memory and a hard disk, or SSD. So so it's a very short term. Now this memory is really crucial. It's really crucial for our functioning. Without it, we can't function at all. And so it's a way to process. So this memory is a short-term thing in order to be able to process actual information, and in order to actually learn things, in order to do stuff, etc. So the more of it you would have, the more powerful you essentially become in processing a very complex things. Unfortunately, we don't have that. There is a limit to it, and a very, very hard, a very small limit. So, so in order to we use that memory, we use that what we call cognitive load is in a certain ways. And so I'm going to split out 3 kinds of cognitive load. So the first one, intrinsic cognitive load, is the effort needed to change the product. Okay, so you need to actually make some kind of a change. Okay, so in code terms, you need to change the product. So there's a certain information that you already have, and now you need to actually then figure out how to make that actually change. So you're using your cognitive skill or cognitive capacity to do that. The second one, actionless cognitive load, is the effort needed to read and understand what to change in the product. So before you can change something, you first need to understand what the heck is it. Okay? So the third one is germane cognitive load, is the effort needed to develop permanent knowledge. So it's basically an act of learning. Okay? So it's not the amount of knowledge that you have. This is the key thing. It's not the amount of knowledge that somebody has, it's actually the process of acquiring knowledge. So it's you're using that short-term memory to acquire knowledge. Okay. Now, and this is also a bit of a connection to Craig's talk. Is essentially what we humans are good at is this acquiring knowledge, and so to be able to constantly adapt. So why the first two in red and the third one in green? Well, essentially you can consider simplistically the first two is just simply waste. Okay, you don't want to do it. That's hence the AI and stuff, etc. You don't want to spend effort to change the product. Just ask AI, do it, let it do it for you. Okay. So and also every possible way trying to figure out not to spend that effort. Okay. So it should be like this. The second one, actioners cognitive load, is you also don't want to spend effort to figure out what needs to be done. It's actually also waste, so you want to minimize that waste. It's a necessary waste. Okay, so unfortunately we always have it, but you can reduce it, and the less of it, the better. The third one is different because you want to optimize it. So where does it come from, this typical terminology? It's actually from education space. Educational scientists. They talk constantly about how to reduce the effort to acquire knowledge. And now you see the connection with Craig's talk. AI helps us also to optimize acquiring knowledge. Okay, so that's it's not about reducing amount of knowledge that you should have. It's optimizing acquiring the knowledge. Okay. Now. Let's dive in deeper, but in a more in context of product development. You could say, so yeah, when we talk about actionless cognitive load, on one hand, you have typically somebody who's actually executing. Okay, somebody needs to actually deliver a task, let's say. Okay, so when there is somebody giving the task, there is a person or group or whatever it is defining a task, and then the people actually. Then somebody is delivering. There's separate people. So in that case, there's a certain cognitive load that happens compared to the right side. Let me explain the right side. In the right side is the same person is basically defining the task and also delivering it. And there's a big difference in between. Let me explain. So on the left side, so the actionless cognitive load is going to be pretty high. Why? Because you're spending significant effort to understand what exactly that person wants from you so that you can deliver the task. So imagine that you're a developer or whatever it is, and somebody tells you what needs to be delivered, you're going to spend that effort. So the thing about that effort is it never gets less, because every time they want something else, and you're going to keep spending the same amount of effort to figure out what they want. Okay? So, that also is a low on German cognitive load. Why? Why bother learning all kinds of stuff? Because just focus on executing whatever you're being told. It's very easy. Okay, so there's a tendency in this kind of mode to not actually spend time learning and just spend time actually optimizing to execute whatever you're being told. Now the right side is opposite, flipped completely. There's a very low actionless cognitive load because the task is defined by me and I'm going to execute. Okay, so there is no transformation of information. So there is no cognitive load involved. I already know what I need to do. Okay, but there is a high germane cognitive load. Why? Because now I need to learn the context. I need to learn what the customer wants. I need to learn what is required, and I need to learn big picture. This takes lots of effort, and especially in the beginning. Okay. But as you can imagine, the more I learn, the more optimally I can work as an individual or as a team. And there is optimization possibility there. While the left one, there isn't one. Okay, so you can't really actually make it better. Now there's several myths. Okay, so the previous part is going to be key to understand actually the next parts. So the first myth, teams are cognitively overloaded because they must know so much about components to properly maintain them. Now, if you understand the first part that I just explained, you understand that it has nothing to do with the cognitive load. Why? Because cognitive load has nothing to do with the amount of knowledge that we have. Understand? It's the process of acquiring knowledge. So let me give you maybe sounds unbelievable, but did you know that there is no limit to the amount of knowledge that we can acquire in our head? There is scientifically no limit to it. The only limit that we have is we die before we reach the limit. Humans can keep acquiring knowledge. In fact, there is this disease, I forgot the name, there is some very special individual in the world, there's only 16 of them or something, they actually remember every single thing in the whole life that happened. It's pretty amazing. It sounds like, wow, that's powerful. Well, some things you don't want to remember, so they also suffer a bit. But they became a subject to a research, and they asked exactly that question. How is it possible they can keep remembering more and more and more and more? Every single minute of their life. Like astonishing. Why there is no limit? They're still trying to figure out the answer. Because we're not computers. A team feels cognitively overloaded if they have too many responsibilities to handle. Also no. So because cognitive load has nothing to do with the amount of responsibilities that you have. Okay, so it's being kind of like, yeah. So lab developers do only development and maybe testing for better focus. So focus is the one thing. And that's what I want to take, because that's the number one argument, is that basically say, if I only do that, then I'm focused. Then I don't need to kind of think of that. I lack focus. This is a very, very common argument. Let's talk about it. Which is the actual problem. Teams and people do feel overwhelmed in companies. They don't have focus. This is a very, very common problem. Well, we need to zoom out to understand, which is organizational issues that happen. Okay? Let me kind of simplify. First simplify to kind of give you a bit comparison between two types of organizing product development. One is essentially optimizing for low technical dependence between teams. Okay, so each team has their own stuff and their own stuff they work on, and don't need to think about other stuff, and so they can do it really, really well. Okay, so in that case, so each team is independent in that terms, in technical terms, but they're highly interdependent when it comes to the customer need. Why? Because in order to fulfill one customer need, you need multiple teams. Okay? So hence, organizations adopt all kinds of practices and structures on top of the teams in order to establish that. Otherwise, you can't get anything done. Hence, you have all the frameworks and people, etc., etc. So, second one is exactly opposite. In that case, you have teams which have a very high autonomy on the customer level, but they do not have autonomy on a technical level. They have to really collaborate. Okay? Autonomy in terms of you can do whatever you want without discussing with another team. You can't. So you have to discuss with another team before you actually do something about it. Okay? So this means that there has to be a really cross-alignment across teams, but then each team is autonomous when it comes to delivering for the customer. They themselves, each team can decide and all kinds of things and deliver completely. That's the most important part of autonomy. Okay. Now, obviously there's all kinds of in-between forms, like project-driven organizations. I'm not going to dive in, I think you're already familiar with the issues. So, where you basically, low autonomy solving customer problem, you're just being told what to actually execute. Low autonomy building, okay, and teams are also performing temporary resources, which is just bad at all levels, okay, so this is just a bad idea in general. Unfortunately, there's still many organizations who do this. Second one, the typical consequence is contra game. Another one is that you have fixed departments, so people do actually have ownership of certain components, but then the projects are basically defining what needs to be delivered, and then you have a low autonomy solving customer problem, high autonomy building, but still slow delivery simply because things are so interconnected and all these projects are kind of competing with each other, etc., etc. Another one is that you have projects, but the people are resourced into the projects. So meaning that on the right side you have a specialist, and in this case you have a high autonomy solving customer problem because those people are in the project, they're committed to that project, they're just resourced into. And but then low autonomy building it. Why? Because at some point it's going to be handed over, so it's also decided by the project how you build it, etc. The project deadlines actually are demanding how things are going to be built. And maintenance hell, because people are going back to the different projects, who's going to actually maintain the thing. Isolated group, this is very common. Others also very common, by the way. This one also common. You introduce, let's say, LeSS, and you actually introduce with one group of teams, but the rest of the organization is not. So what happens is you have a high autonomy in solving specific customer problems, okay? High autonomy in building, except stuff that is actually cross-cutting that group and other teams, okay? And you still have a dependency hell with the teams outside the group. It's a very, very common problem. So still, anything that actually requires teams from inside the group and outside the group end up with still big trouble to actually deliver it. Okay. Now, this I stole from an old slide from, I think, so in this case, we have a typical organizational structure that happens so often and they have different terminologies, and they basically organize a group of teams which are really then owning the components, okay? And so each team owns a certain set of components, and they kind of are grouped in a business grouping, let's say, whatever you want to call it. And so the idea is that you solve the problem completely. So this is commonly called a Spotify model or all kinds of funny terminologies. And so it has a low autonomy solving customer problems still. Why? For a simple fact, they are component teams. They are focusing on one slice. Sometimes they're called value streams, by the way. Okay, so it's the same problem. Value streams, it's a nice new terminology to actually still have a component teams with the same problems. Because anything that requires work across multiple teams owning specific components will end up with the same trouble of dependency hell and putting a structure on top and making sure that somehow you deliver the stuff, etc., etc. Okay? So each team has a high autonomy building. They're really owning it, and they call themselves agile, whatever you want to call it, etc. But the problem is the customer doesn't require separate result of each team. They require those things to work together. Okay? Now, let's dive in. So you kind of wonder, like, how does it relate to cognitive load? Okay. So if you have narrow or per team ownership of component or value stream, whatever you want to call it, ability to work on the highest customer value diminishes. Okay. So it gets less. Because you unable as a teams to work on the highest customer value, and but the company actually does need to make sure that you're working. What happens is then number of initiatives start to increase. So company will inevitably make sure that everything is working. So if you have the number one thing to do is I don't know, something in a new AI engine, blah blah blah, for the customer to actually do stuff. Okay, so who's going to work on that? I guess these three teams here, let's say. Okay, so good. That's the most important thing. That's going to actually deliver us really a huge amount of value, etc. But what is the rest going to do? Usually it's just one team, by the way, this kind of stuff. So what we do is we then invent projects. We invent work. Whether they have a customer value or not, that doesn't matter that much. Okay? So we start to introduce amount of initiatives and teams and work. This leads to a behavior of utilizing teams, making sure that all teams are actually working. Okay? Good. So then, if you have that, okay, so if you have a narrow ownership per team, so number of teams required to deliver complete value increases. Okay, so not only you have multiple teams doing all kinds of different stuff, but also per initiative, because they're component teams, you need right now this team to work on it, but then later on you're going to need this team, that team, etc. Because they're waiting actually, they are doing something else, Okay, so now we have multiple initiatives to take care of, and also dependency on each other increases. Okay, so this leads to switching between initiatives. Okay, so teams need to, on one hand, take care of some kind of dependency on another team, on another hand, also do their projects. Okay, and typically they have a multiple of them. So they end up in juggling between distinct tasks and priorities. So typical complaint then, what happens is the team says, I have too many stuff, we have too much stuff to do. Okay, and they say we are overloaded. Okay? So, this points out to how number of different initiatives of how actually existence of component teams leads to more initiatives being created, more context switching, and therefore more being overwhelmed, or really cognitively overloaded. Now, goes further. If you have many initiatives, simultaneous projects requiring multiple teams, you can put yourself in the shoes of the stakeholders wanting this stuff. So each of them is basically want their stuff to happen. So what they do is they start to compete with each other, but how they compete, they go to the same team and start to yell harder. Okay? When is my stuff going to happen? How come you're so late? How come it takes so much time? Why do they do that? Might be because they are late and lazy and stuff. But also, very strongly I noticed, because the stakeholder knows if I don't do that, the other stakeholder is going to do it at cost of my project. Okay? So they have a very strong incentive to show that behavior, which from a typical engineering point of view looks like a really bad behavior. So this is so awful, blah, 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 blah. They're not awful, they're just part of a system, which is ironically caused by engineering, because they have component teams. Understand? So, and then, so the effort to manage those stakeholders, so somebody needs to manage those stakeholders. Okay? So we have these product owner per team, all these people who need to manage the stakeholders. So what you should be seeing here is when somebody says we need to manage the stakeholders, there's already something wrong. You don't need to manage stakeholders. And when we say manage, we mean literally sitting in the meetings and constantly arbitrating between this fighting about it, and or trying to please everybody, and nobody gets pleased, and etc., etc. So generally waste of time. Because the team shouldn't be delivering stuff for the stakeholders, they should be delivering stuff for the customer. And it doesn't mean that stakeholders are not important, they are important, but it's a completely different positioning of the stakeholders. Okay? So, so which leads to context switching. Why? Because imagine you're sitting with a bunch of stakeholders and you say, okay, for the coming time, you're going to start do for you, okay? And then other stakeholders say, well, when is my stuff going to happen? Okay, let's squeeze a bit of your stuff in. What about me? And so you start to kind of squeeze all at the same time. That's why teams end up with a context switching. Okay. And funny enough, how product owners typically they work, why do we have a typically product backlog which is massive? Is because how do you manage stakeholders? You clever, let's put it, clever product owner, he says to every stakeholder, oh yeah, sure, I'm going to put it in a backlog. Let me put it in a backlog. They put it in a backlog, okay. And so when they, look, it's in the backlog, and I'm going to plan it properly, and then plan obviously shifts all the time, and at the end, you still get smacked by stakeholders, etc. But at least you did kind of a, yeah, you can at least explain something. Okay. Now, the lower part is actually really interesting, and probably not many people know that. If you have lots of initiatives going to a single team, so one team, roughly 7 people, whatever, let's say it's a proper team, blah, 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 and so on, and you say this team should work as a team, meaning the whole team takes a task and focuses on that and delivers, right? But then you have now, one sprint, not one task, you have a whole bunch of them, and they have actually very little to do with each other. But you need to please the stakeholders. Okay? So from very different initiatives, the same components need to change. So what happens is then you work as a whole team on all those tasks. That doesn't make much sense. It's actually extremely inefficient. Why? Because you immediately ask yourself, why the heck should we refine together as a whole team? Because why should everybody know all of the stuff? It's just too much. It's too much to handle, they say. I can't handle this. So what do? You know what, let's split the work up. You focus on that one, you focus on that. Oh yeah, there's also a thing called full stack developer. You are a full stack developer, you're gonna do everything, okay? Only by yourself. But I need to learn a lot. Right now, immediately. I'm cognitively overloaded, I say. Okay? So, this leads to basically dissolvement of the teams. Teams are typically, my observation, I wonder for a very long time, why do I see not many real teams? They all claim to do Scrum, Agile, blah, 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 but then I come there and they're clearly not working as a team. They all have their Jira tasks assigned to each other separately, and they're working on that. The reason is component teams. So, obviously the distance from a customer becomes larger because people are so focused on their own tiny area that actually leads to being more and more distant from the customer. Now, if you have, obviously the business says, you know what, we have these projects, but there are certain things that must happen, okay? Must happen now. So there's several things how C-level typically, we have a part of C-level here, so how C-level typically thinks about stuff is if you need to make it something happen now, okay? So they either first start to yell harder, like why the heck is not getting delivered, okay? It takes ages, well, why it takes ages? This is why, component teams. So too much stuff at the same time. And, but then they say, okay, we need to do something. So one thing, if you have too much money, and that's a usually bigger problem than not enough money, so they start hiring more people because they need to do more. Because the existing people are already busy with the existing stuff, okay? But then if you don't have enough money, they start to then move people around. So these people are working for a long time, working on certain components, and then there's a need somewhere else. So we're going to shift those people. Let's move them there. Okay, but then what happens typically is that somebody says you can't just move them there because existing work needs to continue. So what do? 50% of you, we take a knife, and we're going to work on that stuff, and 50% of you are going to do that stuff. That's I heard the term fractional engineer. Now, if there is something waste of money, it's a fractional engineer. Okay. So, but the reason why they do that is what I just explained to you. Okay, there's a reasoning behind it, and they don't have much of a choice because you don't have endless money to keep hiring people. So they end up with fractional stuff. So. And now ownership leads to reduced focus, as you just now noticed. If you, as a team, focus on just one component or one aspect or whatever it is, value stream, it actually leads to less focus over time, as you just now noticed. It's not more focus, because what we think more focus on this component or stuff, in reality is actually not more focus. Because the code is not the problem. The problem is dealing with all those different requests. That's where the trouble comes from for the people. Okay? That's why people complain, the developers complain, for lack of focus. Not because the code, it's because all that stuff happening. Okay. Now, another thing, if the scope of ownership expands, and the more it expands, obviously opportunity to expand knowledge increases. So this is very attractive for people to actually grow themselves in a company. So you learn more, and companies contributing to that. But also, what's even more important, there is a more chance of discovering new stuff, innovation. The more people cover their area, the more opportunity to innovate. Now, let me explain on this. So imagine that you're sitting with expert in quantum technology, okay? And so you come there, I assume there is no expert in quantum technology here, and he says, can you help me innovate? Imagine that you get a question. So what would you do? You're like looking back. I can't, okay, just can't. Well, yeah, why not? You're just human, innovate, blah, blah, blah. The reason why we cannot innovate ourselves here in the room in quantum technology is because there is no overlap in the knowledge. Okay? So if there is an innovation happens between different people, if there is an overlap in knowledge between them, so you have to understand each other, you have to understand each other's area, you have to get much deeper into that area. You don't need to be clearly on the same level, but the more you overlap that knowledge, the more opportunity to actually innovate. Okay? Just being different doesn't mean that you can innovate in a certain area. So some of you have you heard of Conway's law? Yeah, a few people. Oh, number of people. Okay, good. So it begs the immediate question for people who know Conway's law, who say, what about Conway's law? Okay, the Conway's law says that organizations resemble the architecture of organizations, the software resembles the organizational structure that you actually put in place. Okay, so so are we ignoring that? Actually, not at all. Okay, so so the thing that's what typically, by the way, people think about Conway's law. But anybody knows what's actually the conclusion of Conway's law? What's the actual advice that Conway gave? Anybody idea? His advice was never actually to organize teams according to the structure of architecture that you want. His advice was always to create a flexible organization. It's actually implicitly to avoid this kind of a connection between architecture and organization. Okay. So just to kind of, for other people who don't know what Conway's law is, to explain a bit in simple terms what it means. So typically, let's say you want to have an ideal organization. Okay, so you say, I'm an online shop, let's say. So therefore, I foresee an architect, you might be architecting really, really well, let's say. There's a team which is working on a shop aspect. Okay, so there's actually selling stuff and creating microservices there, etc., etc. And then a second part is a product catalog, there's another team, and then a sales and marketing, another team, and support. Makes sense, right? Kind of makes sense. Okay, so they can work on the stuff, they're fairly independent from each other, and so why not organize kind of like that? Well, because customer need goes like this. Pretty much always. Yeah. And so that's what's happening. And so this leads to all kinds of trouble of managing and delivering stuff. Now, another thing is that it's never really like this. There's always a shared component stuff. Now, the most common one that I've seen is core banking. And it's, so that's every single bank has a core banking component team. And so almost every, we don't have it, right? So, so the core banking team. So there's one team which actually focuses only on core banking. Okay, but then you immediately create a dependence between customer-facing teams and that core banking team, which leads to issues, etc., etc. So, this is just an ordinary component team issue if we create it. Okay. So, by the way, am I saying here that you shouldn't have a specialized team for specific components? No. For the components which are standardized, so meaning commodity, has become a commodity, you should definitely not put it in the responsibility of the feature teams. But there is also no connection anymore between customer delivery and that component. Let me give you an obvious example, managing virtual machines or something, infrastructure. Don't put that responsibility in feature teams because it's too standard. So there's a certain gray area where you need to think, obviously. But that matters. So dependencies then lead to very high cognitive load. So the more narrow the ownership is, the more teams owning a shared component other teams depend on, so they create more dependencies because of this actually narrowness of ownership. The more dependency between teams due to the shared components, which leads to delays and context switching, which leads to cognitive load. Okay, good. So this is a quite technical one. The idea is also sometimes that you have simply make sure that people talk to each other through API. Okay, that's clearly, I'm a software engineer, and I don't know why people keep mentioning that. In reality, it really doesn't work. So you can't develop a system where multiple teams working on their components and they just talk to each other through API. If the teams don't collaborate, you're not going to look pretty. Yeah. So also maybe underrated a lot is the growing architectural mess. And so typically we see mess in architecture and wonder like, how did we end up here? My argument, one of the major reasons is because of this, because of the component teams, the whole dynamic that kind of plays out. It creates a bigger and bigger mess. And so how to overcome? Less, I'm not going to explain it, etc. So if the shared ownership is very wide, so the wider the shared ownership, the less cognitive load you get now. It's exactly opposite message to what you possibly hear if you kind of look on the internet, where they claim you need to have a narrow ownership. I say you need to have a broad ownership to reduce the load. Oh yeah, isn't shared ownership even worse? I mean, you need to suddenly spend a significant effort to learn lots of stuff, take care of many components, and blah, 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 blah. Well, in the short term, that could happen because you need to remember to spend germane cognitive load in the beginning to actually deal with that. That's true. That's a short-term thing, germane cognitive load. That's why I explained the first slide. Okay? But also, it leads to a very strong incentive to improve the readability of the code and testing, etc., because other teams cannot work on it if it's not good. I'll skip this one. Too many meetings. I don't think I need to explain. So typically, if that's a typical complaint, so many meetings. Well, the reason for that is because they are, the thinking is other people are going to take care of coordination, but they always need engineers also to be involved, no matter what. And so the engineers still end up in meetings. And thank you.